Hey everybody, it's your human anatomy and physiology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we're continuing our fourth unit in the skeletal system by discussing ossification, which is bone formation. And we got four different ways that happens. The development of bone in an embryo, the growth of bones until adulthood, remodeling of bone, and what's called repair of fractures. So ossification is really just the formation of new bone, and that has to happen for several different reasons. And we're going to talk about each one of those today. And again, I'd like to dispel the notion that bones are kind of like this dead tissue that just kind of like hold you together and like everything else is living around it, and that's not true in the slightest. It's really active, and it's really important for the rest of homeostasis, and that's actually what we're going to end the video with today, is a discussion of how bones help maintain homeostasis as well. All right, so let's talk about embryonic development. If you can believe it, the embryonic skeleton is pretty much all cartilage. So cartilage is obviously not bone. Cartilage plays a huge role in the skeletal system even after you're an adult. We talked about the articular cartilage at the end of a long bone in our last video, reducing friction and allowing joints to be, smooth and not have those bones grinding up on each other, because that's terrible. It's painful and it'll cause heat and friction and a whole bunch of bad stuff. But anyway, cartilage is what our bone develops from. All right, so ossification actually has to start with cartilage before it becomes bone. So during development, much of the cartilage becomes bone. So to begin with, cartilage is pretty much all your skeletal system is until about 6 weeks, and then you start ossifying. So cartilage still remains in your body in particular areas, like I mentioned before, at the ends of long bones and joints. Parts of your ribs are actually cartilage as well. It's called costal cartilage, and it allows your chest cavity to expand a little bit when you're taking in breath. So that's what costal cartilage does, and of course the bridge of your nose is cartilage as well, and the pinna of your ears are cartilage as well. So cartilage still maintains a very important role, despite the fact that it gets replaced mostly by bone as you develop into a person. All right, and there's two types of embryonic development. The two types of, or I should say, ossification during embryonic development. One is called intramembranous, or intra means within, and membranous refers to membrane, so this happens within a membrane. And we'll look at a diagram of intramembranous ossification later on. But what you need to know is that intramembranous ossification produces flat bones, so like your skull, clavicle, mandible. Is it your mandible? I don't know. I'll have to look that up. But anyway, it forms flat bones. Okay, so if you've ever, taken care of babies before, babies have a soft spot right up here. And what that soft spot is, it's basically the junction of bones that haven't quite ossified yet. So you've got, we talked about flat bones in our last video, your parietal bone, frontal bone, temporal bone. Those are all flat bones, right? So through intramembranous ossification, what happens is that all of those bones tend to fuse together, and there's actually lines on the surface of the skull. They're called sutures that serve as kind of like where those two bones meet and where they ossified. So right up here is where your temporal bone meets your frontal bone meets your parietal bone. So right here in babies, that's where they have a lot of cartilage, and that area needs to be extra protected. Not only because it's not bone yet, and you need to protect your brain, but also because babies' heads are huge, and it's tough to try and protect their brain when their heads are like, their neck muscles aren't even strong enough to hold their heads up. Plus, they have that soft spot, so it's dangerous. All right, be careful with your babies. Anyways, number two, endochondral ossification. That's another kind that happens during embryonic development, and it turns cartilage into bone in long bones. All right. So I believe there was a picture in our last video of endochondral. Oh, maybe I was making things up. Anyway, endochondral. Oh, here it is. Endochondral ossification. This is an embryonic bone. It's got a lot more cartilage, and then it kind of extends out throughout your life, and that's called endochondral. It turns cartilage into long bones. All right. So after you're born, your bones are still growing, and your bones are still growing well into adulthood, if you can believe it. So epiphyseal plates, which we looked at in our last video, growth plates, allow for growth of a long bone during childhood. So that kind of thin line that we looked at in the adult bone, it's right over here. That's the epiphyseal plate, and it's bone now once you're an adult, or once you're done growing. But at one point it was cartilage, and that was expanding from there through endochondral ossification. So new cartilage is continuously formed, and older cartilage becomes ossified. Right, so it kind of expands out, and that's how you get taller. It's not like the end of your bones reach out. It's like within the end of each bone kind of expands outward. So if that makes sense. Anyway, cartilage is broken down and bone replaces cartilage. We already talked about that. All right, so like in this scan over here, you got your epiphysis and the physis, or the growth plate, epiphyseal plate. It's right this thin line right there. So their radius is going to grow from that line. All right. Let's keep going. Another third type of ossification is called remodeling, and this is really, really important for normal skeletal system functioning. Bone forms before birth, and it continually renews itself. So you actually get a new skeleton about every, I want to say, like 3 to 4 years. Your entire skeleton kind of replaces itself, which is kind of crazy. But old bone that might be damaged, or it just might be old or brittle or something like that, it's continuously destroyed by the action of osteoclast. It's broken down and it's replaced by new bone, which is by the action of osteoblast throughout an individual's life. So I use the metaphor of, like, you gotta, if you're redoing your house, right, you gotta demo the old stuff and then you build the new stuff, right? So that's kind of how bones work. That's kind of a crappy metaphor, but you get the idea. You got to break down the old stuff before you bring in the new stuff, and that's called remodeling, just like you remodel a house, right? So osteoclasts and osteoblasts actually have to work together in order for us to have these new skeletons, and in order for our bone density to stay strong. So minerals in bone tissue are constantly being deposited and withdrawn. Okay, so like you might have had the question when we were discussing osteoclasts, like, why would you ever want cells that break down your bones? Well, it's just to get rid of the old stuff so that osteoblast can lay down new bone tissue. And yeah, you get new skeletal tissue all the time. Just normal wear and tear on your bones just uh, allows it to be replaced, and then actually putting more stress and putting more strain on your bones allows for better bone remodeling. That's actually called Wolff's Law. We're going to look into that in a little bit. And here's the thing about that too. Exercise, hormones regulate this. A hormone secreted by osteocytes regulates how osteoblasts and osteoclasts actually work. But here's the thing, exercise increases osteoblast activity, right? So the more strain and the more stress that you put on your bones, whether it's cardio or lifting or anything like that, it actually puts stress on your bones and triggers osteoblasts to produce more mineral salts and produce more bone tissue, which is crazy. It's crazy that you have to do that. So think about this. If you're out in space, you have no gravity. You're in a zero gravity environment, and the weight of the world, so to speak, is not pulling down and causing strain in your bones. So what astronauts need to do in space is they need to exercise constantly in order to maintain their bone density. We'll watch a video on that later on. We got some really good stuff from TED Ed about bone remodeling and astronauts and stuff. All right. Moving on from there, our last reason that ossification occurs is the repair of fractures. All right, so once a bone is fractured, repair proceeds in a predictable pattern. All right, so here's the thing about bone. We took a look at an osteon earlier in this unit in our first video. Bone is very, very vascular. It has a great access to oxygen, nutrients, whatever else that it might need in order to repair itself in the case of a bone. So, in the case of a fracture. So, like, you break your collarbone, right? You're gonna have, you're gonna be in a sling, or you break your radius, you're gonna have a cast on, and after a while, the bone is able to repair itself. Nothing about the cast or the sling is, helping you heal, other than it's just restricting your motion in it. So your bone is able to repair itself very, very well. So we're going to talk about how it repairs itself. Just a brief overview here. But right after a break, about 6 hours after you break the bone, a fracture hematoma develops. And a hematoma, if you take a look at the first part of that word, hema refers to blood, and toma actually is another word. I think it's actually soma, but hema refers to blood, so it's a big blood clot that forms, and it's called a hematoma. And that's going to be the first step that occurs after a break. The second and third steps involve the formation of a callus. So here's the hematoma. It's a blood clot trying to hold this whole thing together, and it eventually will become ossified, and that's this little knob here is what's known as a callus, and that's evidence of a fracture repair. It's going to take up to a few weeks to as many as 6 months, depending on how serious the fracture is. All right, and then the final step, of course, is the remodeling. And by breaking down the old stuff and bringing in the new stuff, just as we were talking about before, over time that callus should become, or should be pretty close to, the original unbroken bone. All right, so again, it's pretty remarkable that bone is able to heal itself so quickly. And that's partly due to the fact that it's so vascular and it has a great access to blood. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is how the skeletal system maintains homeostasis. It stores minerals such as calcium and phosphorus. So calcium and phosphate salts, that is a lot of what makes up what's called the ground substance of that bone connective tissue. Yeah, so it's not stored in cells, it's stored in the non-living tissue, it's known as the ground substance outside of the cells. It maintains homeostasis by protecting the brain. You know, that's a big deal. And protecting your other viscera like your heart and lungs, that's a really, really big deal, because those are important, you know, your heart and lungs and brain. All right. That is it for this video, I believe. Let me just double check. Yep, it is. So let me know if you have any questions, and we will see you next time. Bye.